You know that feeling when you're standing at the edge of something and you know that the moment you take the next step, there's no going back? Maybe it's a hard conversation you've been putting off, a decision you've been dreading, a door you know, the second you walk through it, changes everything. January 49, BC, northern Italy. A small, unremarkable river called the Rubicon. On one side, a man. On the other, the fate of the greatest civilization the ancient world had ever seen. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. And he wasn't standing there because he wanted war. He was standing there because he'd run out of every other option. To cross this river with an army was treason. It was war. It was the end of 500 years of everything Rome had built. He knew that, and every soldier behind him knew that. Caesar looked across the river at what was waiting for him on the other side. Then he said 4 words that would echo for the next 2,000 years. The die is cast. This is Caesar versus Pompey, the rivalry that killed the Roman Republic. To understand how 2 of the most powerful men in the world ended up trying to destroy each other, you first need to know who they actually were. Not the marble busts, not the history book versions, the real men. Julius Caesar, by his own family's reckoning, shouldn't have been anyone particularly special. Yes, he came from a patrician family. But patrician just meant noble on paper. In reality, the Caesars were broke. As a young man in Rome, Julius was known more for his wit, his charm, and his genuinely alarming level of debt than for any great achievement. He was the guy at every dinner party that everyone loved. Sharp, funny, impossible not to like. But charm only gets you so far. What made Caesar genuinely dangerous was what sat underneath it. A cold, precise intelligence. An almost unsettling ability to read people, read rooms, read battles before they happened. He spent nearly a decade as governor of Gaul, what is now France, turning what should have been a quiet provincial posting into one of the most brilliant, brutal military campaigns in history. He came back rich, battle-hardened, and surrounded by soldiers who would die for him. Not out of duty, out of love. That distinction matters. Remember it. Pompey was a completely different animal. Where Caesar was still writing his legend, Pompey had already finished writing his. By his mid-30s, this man had cleared the entire Mediterranean Sea of pirates. Not reduced them, cleared them in 3 months. He marched east and toppled kingdoms that had stood for generations. And he came home with so much gold that Rome didn't quite know what to do with it all. The city gave him a name, Magnus, the Great, and he wore it like it was the most natural thing in the world. The Senate trusted him. The old families loved him. He was Rome's golden boy, living proof that the Republic still worked, that it could still produce greatness. And here's what makes this whole story so much more painful than a simple rivalry. These 2 men were not always enemies. They were partners. Caesar gave Pompey his daughter Julia in marriage. And by all accounts, in a world where political marriages were cold transactions, Pompey and Julia genuinely loved each other. Which means this isn't just a story about 2 powerful men clashing. It's a story about 2 men who were once family, and what it cost the entire world when that fell apart. By the late 60s BC, Rome had a problem it couldn't quite bring itself to admit out loud. The Republic, this beautiful, complicated machine of Senate votes and magistrates and checks and balances, was choking on its own success. Rome had grown from a city-state into a Mediterranean empire, and nobody had ever bothered to redesign the government to handle that. Corruption was everywhere. Elections were being bought. The old rules were being openly laughed at. Into that chaos stepped three men who decided, quietly and without any official ceremony, to simply carve Rome up between themselves. Caesar, the brilliant upstart, Pompey, the celebrated conqueror, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man so obscenely wealthy that ancient writers genuinely struggled to describe it accurately. He didn't just own property in Rome, he effectively owned whole districts of it. The richest man alive, possibly the richest man who had ever lived. Their deal, what historians call the First Triumvirate, wasn't an official government body. There were no documents signed, no public announcements. It was a private handshake between three enormously powerful men that essentially said, "You help me get what I want. I'll help you get what you want. And together, we'll make sure nobody else gets in our way." Pompey got his eastern military settlements ratified by the Senate. Caesar got the governorship of Gaul and the army that came with it. Crassus got rich business contracts, and Rome, for a brief moment, got something resembling stability. But the triumvirate had a flaw built right into its foundations. It wasn't held together by shared values or genuine friendship. It was held together by mutual usefulness. And mutual usefulness, as Rome was about to discover, is a very fragile thing to build a world on. In 53 BC, Crassus, desperate for military glory to match his two partners, led a Roman army east against the Parthian Empire. At the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthians didn't just beat him, they destroyed him. Crassus was killed. 40,000 Roman soldiers were lost. It was one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history. The three-legged stool had lost a leg. And then, just a year earlier, something quieter, but in some ways more devastating. Julia, Caesar's daughter, Pompey's wife, died in childbirth. And the baby didn't survive either. It's easy to rush past this when you're cataloging the causes of a civil war. But Julia had been the living, breathing human connection between these two men. Pompey loved her. Caesar loved her. She was the reason this partnership had a heart in it. Without her, what remained between Caesar and Pompey was ambition, suspicion, and the cold arithmetic of power. And between men like these, that was a countdown. The Senate, watching Caesar's power and popularity grow year after year from Gaul, began to panic. They needed someone who could stop him, someone strong enough, respected enough to push back. They turned to Pompey. And Pompey, who had once called Caesar family, let them. By 50 BC, the conflict had stopped being theoretical. It had moved from whispered Senate corridors into something that felt inevitable, like a storm you can see building on the horizon and can't do anything to stop. Here's the trap Caesar was walking into. Under Roman law, when a general's provincial command ended, he had to disband his army before crossing back into Italy. The moment he did, he became a private citizen again. And as a private citizen, he could be prosecuted for anything his enemies cared to charge him with. And Caesar's enemies had been sharpening those charges for years. They weren't interested in a fair trial. They wanted Caesar finished. If he walked back into Rome without his army, he knew exactly what was waiting for him. Not a hero's welcome, but a courtroom designed to end his career, his freedom, and possibly his life. Caesar tried the diplomatic route first. He wasn't a man who threw himself into conflict when negotiation might work. He proposed a deal. He would disband his legions if Pompey disbanded his at the same time. Nobody gets an unfair advantage. Both men walk back into Rome as equals. The Senate rejected it. They didn't want equality. They wanted Caesar declawed. On January 7th, 49 BC, the Senate passed its final decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, emergency powers, an ultimatum: lay down your command immediately, or be declared an enemy of Rome. The message reached Caesar in Ravenna. He read it, set it down carefully on the table, looked at it for a long moment. And then he called his officers together and gave the order to march. The Rubicon wasn't a dramatic river. It wasn't wide or wild or particularly impressive to look at. It was a boundary, a line scratched into the geography of Italy by Roman law that said, on this side you may have an army. Cross it with your legions, and you have declared war on your own country. Caesar stood on that bank and understood exactly what crossing it meant. It meant no more negotiations, no more politics. It meant that one of two things would happen from this moment forward. Either he would win completely and reshape Rome in the aftermath, or he would lose and be executed as a traitor. There was no third option anymore. The ancient sources say he paused there for a long time, that he paced, that he spoke quietly to the men around him about the weight of the step they were about to take together, yet that even Caesar, the man who never seemed rattled by anything, felt this one. And then he looked up and said it. Let the die be cast. In that single moment, Caesar went from general to revolutionary, from politician to threat. And Pompey, the great Pompey, conqueror of the East, the man Rome had trusted to defend it, didn't stand and fight. He grabbed the senators who supported him, and they ran. They fled Rome without a battle, without even much of a plan. Caesar marched into the greatest city in the world without losing a single soldier, without a drop of blood. But that was the easy part. What followed was a war fought across thousands of miles, from the ports of Italy to the coastlines of Greece to the deserts of North Africa. It was fast, brutal, and full of moments where the whole thing could have gone either way. Let's walk through the ones that mattered most. Caesar moved at a speed that genuinely caught people off guard. His first target was Brundisium, Rome's key port on the Adriatic, and Pompey's best escape route to Greece, where his real military strength was waiting. Caesar raced south and bottled Pompey up inside the harbor. For weeks, he tried everything, building barriers across the port mouth, blockading the exits, attempting to physically trap Pompey's fleet. But Pompey was not a man who'd earned his reputation by accident. He slipped through Caesar's blockade in the night, across the Adriatic with his army intact, and reached Greece. Caesar stood at the waterfront, looking at the empty harbor, and reportedly said that Pompey had stolen from him the chance to end this quickly. He was right. This war was going to be long. The two armies eventually squared off near Dyrrhachium in 48 BC, and here Caesar came closer to total disaster than he ever publicly admitted. Pompey had a larger army, better supply lines, and control of the sea. Caesar, in a move that was either genius or madness depending on how it turned out, decided to try to besiege Pompey's entire force, building a wall stretching miles along the coastline to cut off Pompey's supplies and force a surrender without a pitched battle. It was a staggering feat of engineering, and it nearly worked. But Pompey had a spy inside Caesar's camp. Someone gave away the location of a weak point in Caesar's lines. Pompey hit it with everything he had. Caesar's men were routed, thousands killed or captured. Caesar himself rode into the chaos trying to rally the retreat and nearly got cut down in the confusion. That night, Caesar reportedly turned to his officers and said, "Today, the enemy would have won if they had a commander who knew how to win." Part bravado, part desperate prayer. The two sides met for the final time at Pharsalus. The numbers alone tell you how bad Caesar's position looked on paper. Pompey had roughly 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Caesar had around 22,000 men. He outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. Pompey's strategy was straightforward and smart. Use his overwhelming cavalry advantage to sweep around Caesar's right flank, collapse his line from the side, and end the war in a single afternoon. It was the right plan. It should have worked. Caesar had figured it out in advance. He secretly pulled some of his most experienced infantry out of the main battle line and hid them behind his cavalry. When Pompey's horsemen charged, drove Caesar's cavalry back, and swung around to deliver the killing blow. They rode straight into a wall of spears they never saw coming. The cavalry shattered and fled. Caesar's hidden infantry then swung wide and hit Pompey's main battle line from the exposed side. The collapse was total. Thousands of Pompey's soldiers surrendered. The thousands more were killed. In a matter of hours, the largest army in the Roman world fell apart in a cloud of Greek dust. Pompey watched it from the high ground. He watched everything he had built, every alliance, every resource, every soldier who had believed in him, dissolve. Then he turned his horse around, and he rode away from the battle, away from Greece, away from everything. Pompey the Great, the man who cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, who made foreign kings kneel, who Rome had called its greatest living general, was now a fugitive running from the man he had once called family. He had options. Africa, where his allies still held ground. A chance to rebuild, regroup, fight on. But something had broken at Pharsalus that couldn't be put back together simply by finding more soldiers. Pompey was a man who had built his entire identity on being the greatest. And Pharsalus had taken that from him. He chose Egypt. It made sense on paper. Pompey had been a patron of the Egyptian royal family for years. He had personally helped put the current pharaoh's father on his throne. Surely that counted for something. Surely they owed him. But the Egyptian court had its own political chaos to manage. The young pharaoh Ptolemy, 13 years old, controlled entirely by his senior advisors, looked at Pompey and saw not a powerful ally, but a dangerous problem. Caesar was coming. Caesar was winning. The math was brutal and simple. Shelter Pompey. Make an enemy of Caesar. Hand over Pompey. Maybe earn Caesar's gratitude. On September 28, 48 BC, one day before his 58th birthday, Pompey was invited ashore. He climbed into a small rowing boat with a few of his men to meet his supposed allies. His wife Cornelia watched from the deck of the ship. She wrote later that something felt wrong about that boat from the moment it pushed off. Too quiet. The men around her husband weren't talking, or weren't looking at him. She was right. Pompey was stabbed to death in that rowing boat, meters from the Egyptian shore. His head was cut off and preserved, a gift to present to the arriving Caesar. When Caesar was presented with Pompey's severed head, he wept. He turned away and couldn't look at it. Was it genuine? Caesar was a brilliant political performer. He knew exactly what every gesture communicated. But most historians believed the grief was real. Caesar had wanted Pompey alive. He wanted a public reconciliation, a chance to show Rome his famous mercy, to demonstrate that he could win without destroying. The Egyptians hadn't given him an enemy's corpse. They had taken something from him. And now there was no clean ending, no peace, just more war ahead. Caesar returned to Rome as the undisputed master of the known world. There was nobody left who could challenge him in the field. The war, by every military measure, was over. But winning the war and knowing what to do with the peace, those turned out to be very different problems. In 44 BC, he was declared dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, not for a crisis, not temporarily, forever. For Romans who had grown up in a republic where no single man was supposed to hold that kind of power, where the whole system was designed specifically to prevent it, this was intolerable. It didn't matter that Caesar was, by most accounts, governing reasonably well. The principle was the thing. The republic was the thing. The men who killed him on the Ides of March, Brutus, Cassius, and roughly 60 co-conspirators, were not monsters. Most of them genuinely believed they were saving Rome, that by removing Caesar, they could rewind the clock, restore the old order, bring back the republic that their fathers and grandfathers had believed in. They were completely, catastrophically wrong. Caesar's assassination didn't restore the republic. It just started another civil war. Then another one after that. Mark Antony against Octavian. Brutus and Cassius destroyed at Philippi. 13 more years of Rome tearing itself apart. When the dust finally cleared, one man was left standing. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, had won, and he was smart enough not to make his father's mistake. He didn't call himself dictator. He called himself Augustus, first citizen, the humble servant of Rome. But everyone understood what he actually was. Rome's first emperor. The Republic was gone. And here's the thing. It hadn't been killed at the Rubicon or on the Ides of March. It had been dying for decades before either of those moments, dying of inequality, of corruption, of the impossible strain of governing a vast empire through institutions that were built for a small city and never updated. Caesar and Pompey didn't destroy the Republic. They were produced by its destruction. Two exceptional men, shaped by a system that had run out of peaceful ways to manage power, and who paid for that with everything. 2,000 years later, we still argue about these men, still take sides. Was Caesar a visionary who dragged a dying Republican into something that could survive, a blick into something that could survive, or a brilliant egomaniac who burned down democracy for personal glory? Was Pompey a principled defender of legitimate government, or a vain man who let pride get in the way of the peace he could have made? The honest answer is neither. Both. They were human beings, complicated, brilliant, flawed human beings, caught inside forces far larger than themselves, making desperate choices with incomplete information, in a world that was changing faster than anyone could manage. What haunts me about this story isn't the battles. It's the friendship that preceded them. Two men who were once bound together by politics, by family, each by genuine respect, slowly pulled apart by ambition and circumstance and the merciless logic of power. until they had no choice left but to destroy each other. And in doing that, they destroyed the very thing they both claimed they were fighting to protect. Maybe the real tragedy of the Roman Republic wasn't that it fell. It's that the men who could have saved it were too busy fighting each other to notice it was already gone.